Hello and good evening. Thank you for joining us today for our Advochats. My name is Akhila Randeniya, and today I'm joined by my associate Thathsarani, and we're going to talk about the budget and the upcoming budget and how government expenditure has been working out and what we as Advocata, what we think about it. Um, so Thathsarani, shall we get this started?
Yes, Akira. So let's start a little bit talking about the expenditure of the current budget.
Okay.
So with whatever the analysis that we have done so far, what we kind of realize is that compared to 2023, our expenditure in 2024 budget has increased by 11%. And compared to 2022, it has increased by 68%.
Right.
Right. So we are looking at a more of a expenditure-wise race. But when we look at the composition of the expenditure, what we are seeing is like 2.6 trillion is allocated to kind of cover the recurrent expenditure
Right.
and also to pay interest payments, right? And then 1.6 trillion is gone for to cover up the capital expenditure.
Yeah.
I think the interesting point is the fact that our interest payments are getting increased with every year.
Right.
So this year we have 2.6 trillion. By 2024, it will be increased by 20%, right?
Okay.
So year-wise, the interest payments are going to increase.
Right, it's exponential growth.
It is an
It's also an interesting note. Took a look at the numbers myself. I think the interest cost is much more higher than our recurrent expenditure, if I'm not mistaken,
Yes,
right?
it is a little bit more
It's a
higher.
little bit more, like
Yes,
about
yes.
0.1
Yes,
billion more,
yes, yes.
trillion more, sorry.
Yes.
The numbers always confuse me. So, I mean, if we look at the numbers and we look at, so to give everyone at home a little bit of context, in the IMF program and as a part of it, there was a certain budget allocation that we were supposed to meet, and there's a small estimate that we were supposed to meet. So I think our interest costs are a little bit more than what we were assuming. Sorry, the IMF was assuming for Sri Lanka to be paying. But I think in order to meet the expectations and to meet the estimates, we have reduced our capital expenditure and a little bit of a recurring expenditure as well to stay in line with the budgetary expectations of the IMF. Interesting to note, I think this is the first time in our history that we passed the 6 trillion marker in our budgetary allocations, right?
Yes, yes. This is the first time.
Yeah. So, I mean, monumental steps all around when you look at things. But, I mean, if you look at it, I mean, of course, everyone knows defense, one of our biggest expenditures, health, and I think in 2023, defense was almost the same as the combination of health and education
Together.
to put together, right? And I think so now. I mean, we're talking about revenue and revenue collection. You know, we have taxes that are exist. VAT is now apparently going to go up by
18.
to 18% come 2024. And also, if I'm not mistaken, you know, we have the SCL that got implemented recently. I mean, these all.
Yeah.
Re- re- Putting it aside, the SCL really doesn't help, I think, increase government
Yes.
revenue. I think that's also another issue that needs to be discussed. It is
Yes.
small things like this that
Yeah.
add up, that kind of stint government growth and revenue.
Yes.
Um, so,
To add to what you were saying about the IMF program, I think this
yeah,
budget is really, really critical, at a critical point at a point where we are given a target of achieving a 2.8% of the GDP for a primary surplus,
yeah,
right? By 2024. By 2025, we have to increase it by to 2.3% of the GDP.
right,
So we kind of have to increase our revenue, but reduce our expenditure. So this for primary surplus, we don't take into account our interest payments.
okay,
Just the expenditure, the other expenditure recurrent
right,
and the
right,
capital
right.
expenditure we have. I think in terms of meeting the IMF targets, in terms of achieving a primary surplus, I think we kind of overperform that target where
Okay.
we have a primary surplus for the first 6 months of 2023
Okay.
of a 31 billion rupees.
How did
Right.
we achieve that, if you don't
So,
mind me asking?
in terms of that, what they have done is, so our expenditure and the revenue that we have gotten for the first 6 months
Okay.
are almost the same. So like
Right.
revenue a little bit higher than the expenditure.
So sorry to
Yeah.
interject, but just to make sense of things, I think that had something to do with increasing our tax base, right?
Yes, our increasing our tax base.
Right.
And then we had the VAT going from 8 to 12 to 15.
Right. Yeah.
Right? So if you take the VAT, just the VAT revenue that we have gotten so far for the first 6 months of 2023 is around 336 billion rupees.
Right.
Just the VAT.
Okay.
This is not even income and other whatever import tariffs that we have.
Okay.
Right? So there's a huge income revenue that has been generated.
Okay.
If you see it, it's like 43% of increase of the revenue that we have gotten so far. If
Okay.
you compare it to whatever we have gotten last year. So in that sense, we have a primary surplus for the first 6 months of
Yep.
2023.
Okay.
But the budget is very, very important because we have to kind of continue and maintain that achieving a 0.8%
Surplus, yeah.
and a 2.3 in the upcoming years. So I think that is very important. But also to point another point that you mentioned also in terms of having a revenue target.
Yeah.
I think for the IMF program, we did not make the cut. We did not achieve the target that the IMF gave us in terms
Okay.
of generating revenue,
Right.
which means we have to increase our tax base.
At
I think
least, yeah.
increasing VAT to 18% is one of the ways that they're going to go about. Because I think we had a loss of 101 billion rupees
Okay.
in terms of 101 billion rupees lower to what we were supposed to achieve.
Okay.
So in that sense, I think this budget will also focus in terms of generating more revenue,
Right.
and then kind of cutting down a little bit of our expenditure as well, because right now, whatever the expenditure we are talking about is also included with the interest payments, right? So for primary
Yeah, yeah,
surplus,
yeah.
we don't care about the interest payment.
Yes. Yeah. It's
Um,
excluded.
Exactly.
So talking about what you said with regard to revenue and generating revenue. Now, a problem that I have personally, and I also think that economically as well, this is a burdening question, is how much can we keep on taxing not just the public, but businesses and other
Exactly.
entities and the economy as a whole
Yeah.
before we start seeing contractions. When it comes to expenditure, when it comes to savings and things
Right.
like that, and especially since we're reducing our recurring and capital expenditure, which essentially means that we're not looking to develop our existing infrastructures
Yeah.
and other revenue generation schemes. So I feel like that's also another thing we need to pay attention to when it comes to the budget speech.
100%.
That's going to happen, if I'm not mistaken, on the
13th of
13th. The first initial reading will be on
Yes.
13th, and the parliamentary debates will be on the 14th. So I
Yes.
think that's something that we all have to look into as well.
Yes.
Um, so yeah, revenue generation I think has to be really important and key in our, of course, I mean in our fiscal deficits and
Yes.
making sure that we are staying okay and making sure that we don't fall back into the liquidity crunch that we did prior. But like another problem that I have, right? So the budget speech, every year it has this amazing language that is appeasing to all, right? If I'm not mistaken, 2019, the state promised to have maternity labor benefits to be borne by the state, and they were talking about how this is going to create exponential growth in the workforce
Yeah.
and get people moving, get the ball rolling, help corporates, not have this burden on the corporations directly, private entities directly, and help them therefore have more money to put into development or increase their profit margins basically, which again then when taxing the more tax revenue for the
Yeah.
state. It was said, but very little was done.
Yeah.
So I think in terms of keeping in touch with reality, we need to pay close attention to what is said at the budget speech. And we also need to make sure that there is some sort of accountability. Because, I mean, the cat's out of the bag, right? We are going to have elections next year, and I think
100%.
it's a must. Because, we can't have stability without legitimacy. And that is an issue that we're facing right now because, I mean, as you can see, there's infighting within parliament. Parliamentarians are claiming that the president is coercing them into taking decisions and whatnot. I mean, it's a whole mess, right? So that is something I think we also need to look into as the public, we have to hold them accountable by just paying attention and not being swayed or, by these sweeping statements that
Yeah.
will be made come Parliament.
Yeah, just to add to whatever you were saying, in terms of making the government accountable for whatever they're saying they're going to do, I think that is very, very important. Second of all, I think I was having a chat with one of the key members, the group chief official at, if I'm not mistaken, Mr. Siriwardana, about
Right.
maternity benefits, right? So one of the questions that I was asking him was that will having maternity benefits, like being state have a kind of part of the cost, bearing the cost of it, would help the corporates, right?
Right.
And he was saying definitely.
Okay.
So obviously corporate, if for them to move forward, for them to even give more benefits to its people,
Right.
something like maternity benefits, even the half of the cost being, or like some percentage of the cost being borne by the state would be a big step in moving forward. But I also think in terms of social welfare,
Okay.
like for programs like social safety networks,
Yeah.
we actually have to really focus in terms of this budget, how much the allocation has been, how the Aswaswam program is going to move forward. Because I think we have some kind of like limitations and complications at the current moment. It's
Okay.
not like working perfectly
Right. The system. Yeah.
because there's this
Getting.
problem in the system,
Yes.
right?
Getting
So
it
we have
targeted.
to
Right.
exactly. So we have to kind of see how it is being carried forward through the budget as well, because like Aswasuma and providing social safety at this crucial juncture is very much important. And also, especially the fact that we also have an election coming up next year, I think that is something that we can kind of gonna see a bit more, I guess.
Yeah, and I think discretionary powers that are granted to elected leaders. I think that I think also really affects our stability when it comes to, not in terms of political stability and
Yeah.
economical stability, but when you look at stability within taxing, right? Because I'm not too sure how many bands of taxing we have, because in the excise department, for and customs, it's ridiculous when you try to make head and tails of how it applies.
Yeah.
I think that's another thing that the budget, well, not the budget directly, but in terms of revenue generation, because we know how much expenditure is, right? It's
It's very
estimated
clear.
to be, yeah,
Exactly.
6.7, 6.3, sorry, 6.3 trillion, right? We know that's an estimate, and hopefully we can stay within those bounds. But we also need to see how much of that 6.3 trillion, how much can we cover through revenue generation. So I think simplifying the tax bands and making the whole tax system is one way. I
Yeah.
think another thing personally I feel like is encouraging the opening of tax files so that we are aware of how many people, increasing our tax base just by having what do you call it, income taxes is
Yeah.
well and good, but there are other taxes that you
Right.
can also make sure that the people who are supposed to be paying the taxes are
Also
paying
paying
their taxes,
taxes.
because I think the diagnostic report that was put out, the governance diagnostic report put out by the IMF, a big thing it highlighted was that there is a lot of evasion, not avoidance, but straight up evasion of people not paying their taxes,
Yeah.
because our tax system is, to put it lightly, very archaic and old. And I mean,
And to add to what you were saying in terms of collecting revenue,
yeah,
taxes, so we have the Inland Revenue Department has the revenue system, right? So
yeah,
it was introduced a while back. The problem is it's not being maintained. You need expenditure, you need money being invested there
yeah.
to kind of maintain it for it to become more efficient and effective in terms of collecting taxes, but that is not happening at the moment, right?
Yeah.
And we also need trained people to like kind of use that system.
Yeah,
Because
people
like
who know
you
how to
and
use the
me,
system.
we
Yeah.
can't go and like use that system. You
Right.
need people who
Specific
know
training, yeah.
exactly. So that is not being done, right? So things like those should be kind of the focal area if we were to like collect the revenue or the like the tax revenue
Yeah.
efficiently and effectively from my point of view.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
I mean, we have to somehow make sure that our revenue goes up.
Yeah.
And I know we've been throwing around, the same few words, deficit, revenue,
Yes.
expenditure, and whatnot. I mean, because the budget in its very nature is complex, but also a very simple thing, right? We need to know where our money is going and how our money is spent, and if our money is being spent in a way that is beneficial for us to get out. I mean, yes, fuel queues no longer exist. We don't have electricity problems, but that really doesn't mean that we're out of a financial crisis,
Exactly.
right? It's still ongoing. We've barely done our restructuring of debt. Our international creditors were still in bilateral talks. I think Exim Bank,
Yeah. Gave
in
a red green
principle,
light.
gave a go-ahead, which should work well, which
But it's
should bear well
also,
for
it
us.
depends on what are the other creditor, whether the other creditors are happy with whatever the Exim Bank said
Yeah,
also.
there's is a lot of things that need to be taken into consideration.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think given the chance, you and I could sit here and talk for hours
Yes.
about the budget and revenue generation and the state and its accountability. But I think a lot of it hinges on what will be said at Parliament on the
Yeah.
13th. Um, we do see that certain ministries have taken massive haircuts. Ministries that I feel like require somewhat of investment into, because I think if you look at certain ministries that have led to growth
Yeah.
are getting some of the lowest amount of investment by the
Yeah.
state, and the ones that are in contraction are getting a lot of. I mean, of course, defense is forever be in contraction, but if you
Yeah.
look at things like health,
Yeah.
education, these things are not getting as enough of
Yeah.
money
Yeah.
that they need to, because I think if you look at GDP, the percentage of GDP that's invested into education, I think we barely got it to 3%,
Right.
3.5% recently. I may be wrong on that, but that was a number that was being fought back from, I think, the 70s or the 80s, to get investment in.
Yeah.
Um, so, is there anything else you'd like to add, Thathsarani, or shall we wrap up?
I think we can wrap off. I think we have spoken a lot about the revenue and expenditure. I think our listeners and our audience can look forward to the 2024 budget. Just to add one point, I just
Yeah.
think when we were talking to Professor Amarajia, one of the things that he was saying about the budget is that we as a country, when we are doing a budget, we always overestimate in terms of our revenue and
Right.
underestimate in
Our
terms of
expenditure.
expenditure. So I think that is something that we have to look out for.
Right. So thank you for joining us today. Catch us next week. We'll keep you updated as on the time and when it will be. And also follow our social media pages in all three languages actually, for content on the budget, what to expect, and I think that we can wrap up. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, everyone.